So I've been again. Well, it's really good to talk to you as always. Love talking about this, and love that you take the time to chat about this and put this info out. Um, I've been thinking a lot about this whole week what we were going to talk about because to me, I feel like even though I have so much questions, sometimes they're not really formed in my head. Sometimes listening to conversations, like a lot of YouTube videos on trauma or reading books, kind of stimulates those questions. So that's what I did. Uh, One thing that interests me specifically about talking with you is kind of this um, idea of bridging what we know about trauma and what it's being applied to mainstream and what the institute has figured out on their own, doing their own research and finding their own solutions to certain problems. Um, and I feel like that's very hard to do because there's a big gap. There's a big jump in what we know and what the institute has. Um, I don't want to say claiming because that sounds uh, like aggressive, but I feel like the word fits just because of where you guys are at personally. Um, so with that, I thought this would be a good topic to talk about, kind of within that context. How can we start connecting what is known in mainstream with what fits very well with the institute's uh, techniques and insights? Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes very much sense. And that's one thing I also try to do since I basically live in both worlds. I see what traditional psychotherapy, traditional medicine knows about trauma, about emotional well-being, and strategies to better that. And I know what the institute and certain other people have done and have discovered. And interestingly, when you take very, very high level picture, um, things look pretty similar. Okay, there are differences in details, but if you combine all methods, you will find similarities, and you'll find differences because certain situations are interpreted by each person who created a modality differently. Um, but the most important one, and that's like the big secret. Actually, it's not a secret; it's out there in the world, but it's so damn difficult to do. Is acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I found. And so, if we could just accept everything that is, we would be healed instantly. It's just so damn difficult.
Why do you think it's
Okay,
so difficult?
and I don't know. Just think about if something happened to you and you felt that's not just, and now I'm telling you, okay, go back and just accept it. You notice how difficult that is?
Yeah, it's like the idea. It's almost like this mainstream idea you see anywhere on Instagram or on Facebook or even just family when people the best advice I can give you is just let it go. Just let it go. Um, like it's the simplest thing. Or we stick to these like old age kind of uh, I guess quotes or sayings or like cookie cutter um truths, or they're not really truths because they're not that easy. Like you just need to forgive. You just need to forgive yourself. You just need to forgive this person. And for most people, that's extremely difficult because it seems like it's more of a mind thing. Like you're just gonna just say the word and it's done, and that's. I feel like most people
Yeah,
don't accept that's not what happens.
exactly. And there's another thing. Um, Forgiveness is something even you find in the Christian Bible and possibly in other religion as well. That this is very very powerful. But if somebody has done you wrong, has wronged you, and you forgive, then from the semantics of the word, you think you basically give that person who has done you wrong the right, and you say it was right to treat me that way, and that obviously is something you can't do because if you feel that you have been treated wrongly, that is so sits so deep within you. If if you that now would have to say, okay, it's okay to treat me so I feel like, um, then then you would deny basically your existence. So that's not possible. But that's why I don't use the word forgive, because of this problematic semantics there. It's just accept. What's the key to everything? You just need to accept that happened. It might have been wrong. It might have violated rules. It might have violated laws. It might have violated ethics, whatever. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it's in the past and you have survived it. So the one thing that what you said, let it go, is basically very similar to acceptance. Just with let it go, you could also swipe it under the rug, basically. You just try to forget about it and ignore it. That's not what this acceptance or letting go means. It's really to just accept that it happened and you move on. And that's still, though there's no right or wrong in there and there's no judging in there, it's still so very, very difficult for us.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you why, but that's, I see after having studied many, many of these techniques, that's one of the common denominators. They all help you to be okay with that. Yeah, you don't have to feel that it's right, but you're okay with what happened.
Are you talking about it primarily from an emotional standpoint? You know, like you're talking about CPL, you're talking about from the perspective of the Institute, and I would say even most, I'm only saying it from the Institute perspective because it's more clear cut, right? You guys say calm, peaceful, and light. So this is how you should feel after you are not feeling traumatized, or to sometimes that word can feel so charged and can kind of confuse people. Just emotionally stuck or emotionally drained or emotionally, you know, like you're still carrying some of that pain from whatever is troubling you. That's
exactly.
That's how it should feel, right?
Right. So we define when we have a session that the end point of a session is the situation when you feel calm, peaceful, and emotionally light. Okay, when you're overweight, you won't lose your weight. You still are overweight, or you still have your body weight, but you feel emotionally light, and it's comparable to if you have carried a large backpack for a while, and you just put that backpack down, there's a lightness to your body afterwards. And that is basically the emotional light which we are referring to. And actually, that's the end point of a good session. So you know that you basically have resolved that issue that you had.
Mm-hmm.
But fundamentally, we could be all living 24/7 in that state, where we wouldn't be triggered into our stuff. We could live like this, and when something happens, we notice that we're not CPL anymore, calm, peaceful, and light, but that we have been triggered into something, and we feel heavy, or we feel agitated, or we feel uneasy or something, and then we just use techniques to resolve that what has happened, and then we just are CPL again. And experiencing life from that perspective is completely different from what most people know.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's very much the case, and I feel like you see it everywhere. Most people are dealing with one thing or another, and the way it plays out, you see it. It's hard to explain what I mean by you see it, but it's just like,
well, usually people we say they're hopping from one trauma to another. Okay, so my boss has done me wrong, my partner has done me wrong, my kids have done me wrong, and now I need a break. Okay, so I go in my car and drive fast. Or I go in my car and I go and buy some ice cream. And then I eat the ice cream, and then for a moment I can't forget who has done me wrong all the time. And then I have to go back home. Oh my God, there's this guy waiting for me, or this woman waiting for me, or something. So it's always, most people are always in this emotional roller coaster. And that's really draining. That's really energy consuming. While you can be calm, peaceful, and light, you say, okay, my boss has a bad day. You're not deflecting. You're just feeling it right now. My boss has a bad day. I'm not emotionally charged. And what am I going to do later? Oh, I'm going to see my partner. And I feel happiness about that. And And then they say, oh, but my partner always complains about her boss or his boss. And then you feel heaviness coming in. You say, okay, I'll just do the technique that I learned. And then you say, okay, no, now I feel I'm happy again to see my partner. Okay, and that my partner complains about his or her boss is something that goes into the background. It doesn't drain me emotionally more. It's just a fact. I accept it as it is. Yeah, it's just the way the experience my partner has right now. But it's not draining me emotionally anymore.
There's this we were talking about stress, I think two weekends ago. And we were talking about how stress is actually just an accumulation of trauma, right? And it comes out as this because it's so emotionally draining. I had a conversation with a friend maybe a couple months ago, a really good friend. And we were talking about, I forgot what. We were talking about change. We were talking about just change in general, you know? It's very common for a lot of people when they experience some form of change in their environment, in their identity, whatever, to feel some sort of stress, you know? Like I'm from moving new apartments to just even getting a new job or anything in between, you know? Like even something like somebody, you know, you getting a new job or your wife finding a new job. Like I'll give you a personal example. Like my wife is working, and we were waiting for her green card paper, so she wasn't able to work legally. Now she is, and just alone the fact that she was, we weren't always together because I've been working from home as well. It initially cost like it didn't feel like terribly horribly. It didn't feel horrible, but it definitely for a few days felt like uncomfortable. And he was saying we were talking about change, and he was saying how, for him it's exhilarating, it motivates him, it energizes him, and it's so interesting because I feel like that's a really good example of somebody who just sees the world differently because there's not this unconscious undesirable feeling that pops up whenever there's change, and the behavioral response is completely different. For him it's exciting and it's an opportunity, whereas for most people change is like, you try to do what you can to not feel so stressed, or you change your behavior as much as you can, or you try to calm down as much as you can, or you try to cope with it as much as you can, where he doesn't have to. And I find that super, super interesting.
And that's beautiful, Sergey, that you say that and that you bring it up, because usually I'm the one always making the point that it depends on the point of view you're looking at it, and change not necessarily needs to be stressful. There are some people who enjoy enjoy change and don't feel the pain of change, and it's really a thing of perspective. And there's, for example, we wanted to integrate different styles of therapy, and in cognitive behavioral therapy they have, I don't know, it's an abbreviation in German. It's called ABC schema. I'm not sure if that's the same in English, but it doesn't really matter. It's very simple. It says that A is the stimulus, the situation, what's happening to you. B is your judgment of this situation, and C is the consequence. Okay, and you said change. Okay, having a new job, changing jobs, waiting for the green card, whatever. That's the situation. That's A. And C is what you feel. The result is stress. Okay, 10 days of stress. And then you look at B, and you look at the situation and ask yourself, how do I perceive the situation? Is the way I perceive the situation the only way possible to perceive that situation? Okay, so if we, for example, now take a neutral example. So somebody gets a new job or looks for a new job, and the result C, that's A, and now C is stress, and now B, the person that is fearful, that says, oh my God, it's a new job, I need to get to know new colleagues, they might not like me, so I come there as the newbie, and perhaps they don't like me, and then they fire me again, and then I have to go for another job, and perhaps my money runs out, and all these things. If that is the judgment of the situation, finding a new job, obviously C has to be stress.
Right.
Okay, because there's fear and the possibilities of defeat and losing money and so on. And so obviously the body needs to have stress, generate energy to combat these possible dangers. Okay, the lion in the room. But if you have the same situation, you're changing your job and your perspective is, oh my God, that's going to be so exciting. I get to know new people. I expand my horizon. I learn new things. I have new abilities. I have new possibilities, new chances. I get to new clients. I enhance my social network. And I get a new email address. I get a new entry in my curriculum vitae and stuff like this. And obviously then your consequence, C, is going to be joy and curiosity.
Right.
Makes sense? So the same situation A may result in very, very different consequences in C, depending on how you judge the situation.
Right.
And you judge the situation depending on what emotional baggage you take with you, what you have in your backpack, basically. Okay, when you have much traumas and traumas activated, you might look very pessimistic onto the world, and then the consequences also, C is also very negative. But when you're like, no, you trust life, you're not so fearful because you know you can do it, and you trust yourself, you have a good sense of self, you're self-loving, you know that you take good care of yourself, then C is something nice.
Correct. And that leads to something I wanted to talk about perfectly, which is like when you talk about trauma therapies, you're talking about something that's relatively new to mainstream psychology, to mainstream understanding. And because we've already had other forms of therapies, right? We've had psychoanalysis, and we've had behavioral therapies, and in this I'm also including CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And a lot of what you see it in some way or another out in the world, right? Which is, positive thinking and change your thoughts and adapt your behavior. And for me personally, I feel like in this scenario that we've created, well, which is actually real, these examples for me personally, they're just not good enough, right? And I think about the fact that the reason I react to this isn't even conscious. I can definitely have some conscious decision afterwards, and try to change my perspective. And to an extent, it's helpful, and I'm sure with time, I can adapt, right? But the underlying baggage, the underlying mechanisms that create these thoughts in me that do not exist in my friend, I feel like are ultimately the biggest issue. Are that they're what needs to be fixed, and sometimes they don't. I don't even know what they are, or most people that get stressed don't really know why they get so stressed. So for me, it's not to like really attack on these therapies. They're fantastic, and I'm so grateful we have more and more that we can help people with. But for me, that's my problem. That's my conflict, So I was wondering if you could clarify that for me. Is the problem, should the ultimate goal be, okay, how can we make sure that when Sergio or anyone else is triggered by something, that they can just not have to change their perspective, but ultimately their perspective is one that's naturally occurring because they don't have any baggage that affects how they think or how they feel. Does that make sense?
Yes, and that's an awesome question. Thank you, Sergio. It's let me just take a little bit a detour here. This ABC, what I explained, okay, the situation, the judgment, and then the consequence. when you look at traditional CBT,
Mm-hmm.
you might have somebody, some therapist, tell you, well, change the situation. I'll give you an example. There is an employee who receives an email from her boss.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and every time she gets an email, she gets anxious. And then you just talk to that lady, and then that lady says, well, I get anxious, not because I receive an email, but because I work on that email, I answer that email, and I never hear back. My boss, it takes weeks until he answers back, so I don't know if it's good or bad what I did. Okay? So if you go the ABC schema, there's an email from the boss. She feels anxious because she doesn't know if her work is good. Okay. And basically feeling anxious is C, and then because she doesn't know if she does good work. Okay. So the email triggers the reaction she has to work. She's not unsure about her work, and C, she gets stressed and anxious. So the CBT therapist might say, okay, change the situation. If you get an email from the boss, answer the email and write down, if I don't hear back from you in 2 days, I assume this task is well done. Okay, what happens in the ABC schema? The situation is avoided, so there's no judgment and there's no consequence. Solution solved, right?
Yes. Yes. I mean, the situation at hand is resolved. You're right.
Yes. So from my perspective, I don't like that, because I don't want to play and manipulate situations, because that's a slight manipulation. Okay, if I don't hear back from you in 2 days, I assume that everything's fine. From my perspective, situations just happen. Okay, whatever happens in life happens. Okay, and you don't have so much influence on it. Okay, so the Corona pandemic happened, or 9/11 happened, and these are big things, and smaller things also happen, like losing a job, or I don't know, running out of money, or whatever. Things happen. Okay, and we cannot always take charge of what happens. Most of the time, actually, we don't. Yeah, it just happens. Okay, because a coworker does this, or that's transmitted in the news, or whatever. And so what we can do is we can change our perspective on what happens. When we notice that we feel stressed, we can look and see, okay, why do I feel stressed? What is my judgment on that situation that leads to stress? Okay. Mm-hmm. That's very reflective thinking. And there's a small hint. If you just have one perspective, it's 100% wrong. There's never always only one perspective. There might be just a small differentiation, but just one perspective, that's not true. But many people, especially people with getting stressed and getting nervous, they just have this one interpretation of the situation. Mm-hmm. Okay? My boss sent that email to me with that task because he knows that I'm going to fail, and then he can fire me. Correct. And if that person has that judgment why he or she received that email, then it's very hard to take another perspective. But the easiest thing is always to ask, is there another way you can see that situation? Did your boss perhaps send you that email because he appreciates your work? Right. And then you notice stress level is sinking already. Okay, because you just took a different interpretation. Right. That's the simplest step. But then there are possibilities. There are possible situations where you can't, where you really, because of what you lived through. Okay, you said, I have been 5 times already in that situation. Every time I get this kind of email from my boss, I'm going to get fired, and it happened already 5 times in my life. So that's the truth. Okay, right. That's a different situation. And then basically you're not able to switch, and that's also you feel heavy, you feel stressed, and that's a very strong indicator of some trauma being activated right now. And then we would do some techniques, and after we've done these techniques, the situation feels completely different. And even though there have been 5 times in the past that you experienced something similar, you just accepted them And you just say, okay, but this time it might be different. It's a different boss, or even it's the same boss, it's a different situation. Yeah?
Yeah.
And it might even be that these 5 situations in the past are the reason why this today's situation is different. You never know. But if somebody is emotionally triggered, that person sees basically just the lion, just the danger. You can't argue with that person. You just need to emotionally calm that person down. And you can do that with these techniques.
But that's the catch here, though, isn't it? That most of our thoughts and most of our behaviors, especially within relationships, any form of relationships, they are mostly trauma based in some way or another. You know, you're talking about the first person and the second person, which are in a way within the same spectrum, right? But couldn't and maybe I miss or maybe I just am getting confused or misinterpreted. Both people could potentially benefit from the same trauma techniques rather than focusing on perspective change, because ultimately wouldn't healing these events that cause him or her or whoever to feel how they feel, wouldn't the perspective change if the trauma was healed regardless? Like, you wouldn't have to be a manager to your feelings or be a manager to your perspectives. You wouldn't have to have all these, well, what did they think this, or maybe it was this, and or like, you wouldn't have to be a manager to your mind that's just a part of you just bombarding you with this negative information, which in turn actually makes it harder to create a more neutral stance and be more clear about it. It limits you. Apart from making you feel terrible, it limits you in what you can actually do in your responses, because you have to become a manager to those things. So wouldn't it be easier to just heal these events, heal these feelings, so that your perspective is one of neutrality, or even actually a positive one?
Yes, obviously. So we learned that the judgment of a situation is heavily depending on your experience, and your experience is heavily depending on your traumas.
Okay.
So when you go and heal your traumas, automatically your perspective changes. And the more you do that, the more positive your outlook becomes. Okay? So, and the more positive your attitudes toward life, towards people, towards behavior becomes. Okay? Because this negative things is not weighing you down. So even my teachers said that, Daniel, you're always doing just the necessary to get by, and that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm just not overdoing things. I'm trying to do things the exact amount how I have to do them.
Correct.
And needing to manage all the situations and always think and analyze and then just, okay, so I have to see it differently. And if I see it from this perspective, oh yeah, that feels better. So it's this perspective I choose. That's too complicated for me.
Right.
But I use this to find my traumas. Okay? When I'm in a situation where I'm stressed, I'm just saying, okay, why am I stressed? What is my view on that situation? Oh, it's a negative one. It's a trauma-based one. It's one where I'm not CPL. And then I heal that trauma, and then my perspective automatically changes.
Okay.
And that's actually awesome, because then you just have to be a little bit alert to certain things. Okay? When you're not CPL, when you're not feeling CPL, you notice that very quickly. When you're not CPL, your heart rate gets faster. You perhaps start to sweat, or you blush in the face, or something like this, like somatic symptoms you get there.
Yeah.
Or you just notice that you're getting uneasy, and then you just could simply go and do the techniques when you learn them. Go to your therapist, do it. And I very much like what Bruce Lipton always says in his talks. He says, you don't need a therapist. You just need to look what's difficult for you and work on what's difficult for you, what feels difficult for you.
Right.
And it's right. Yeah, but sometimes it's very dangerous, dangerous as well, but very scary to work on these things that feel difficult for you. Okay, because then change happens, and change is not necessarily the thing that everybody enjoys.
Correct. And I mean, I don't know if you can talk about this, but I had this conversation with some therapists some time ago. We were talking about holotropic breath work, and for whoever listens to this at some point, if they don't know what that is, it's a trauma technique that's focused on Stan Groff developed it, and it's focused on this form of breathing that kind of bypasses these things that protect you. I don't know what you would call it, but it kind of bypasses anything that would protect you from these negative feelings and kind of just goes head on against, buried feelings that may be really important. It's kind of a rush attack into healing trauma. But one thing that he talks about is he talks about these forms of healing that are very early, like very developmental events. I cannot remember the name of them right now. But he would talk about these rebirthing events within people where they would feel like they're, again, coming out of the womb, right? And for most people, this is probably pretty weird sounding. And it was for me when I heard it. But one thing that stuck out was that since he had done these events, these kind of trauma birth, I'm kind of butchering it, but they're kind of like these healing events. When he would do these like retreats or sessions with a lot of people, since he had gone through these things, and if somebody was struggling, when he would be kind of walking around and supporting that person, it became much easier. It became like way easier for that person, and they were usually able to go through this process they were doing. This is anecdotal, and I understand that. But it's from people who've done this, from therapists who've done this before, and have talked to them with him, and they had this to share with me. To me, what was interesting about that is this idea that if somebody's trying to support you, in this healing process, it's a lot easier when they're not bogged down by the same feelings you might have. And there might be times where what you're dealing with, like you're saying, it's not always the safest. So it is, I'm sure it's really good to have somebody who maybe, when you tap into something that's very, very, very deep, very traumatic to your core, someone who is not dealing with that and might be able to provide, what would they call that? I mean, there wouldn't be any transference or counter transference. I'm a little rusty on my jargon. You could have asked me this 3 years ago, and I would have said it just fine. But I do see the importance of a therapist in a lot of situations. This kind of example being one of them.
Yes. So it's right. Transference and countertransference are the official terms for one of the effects that happens. So when you as a therapist are also triggered by an event, okay, you're not completely clear, and you also see things through a filter, and that might give your client the feeling of that you're also not stable enough, that you're unsure, unsafe, or something like this. So when you are clear with that event and when you're clear with that situation, it's for the client, there's lots of reassurance because your voice is low and slow, and your body posture is very secure for the client. And there's also this atmosphere which you don't see is completely different than when the client goes through something and you as a therapist are like a little bit out of your head, and you're like, oh my God, I hope this is going right, and that's so dangerous, and whatnot, and this could happen, and you listen already to my voice, it's getting higher and faster, not helping in therapy. Okay.
Right.
And but to that, what you said, there are more things. But for example, if you want to become a certified therapist for the Institute for the Study of Peak States, there's a list of topics you have to go through, you have to work through, to be sure that there are requirements, okay, so that there are topics, actual heal topics, that you have to work through before you get certified. because the institute wants to make sure that the certified therapists have a certain standard, and that standard situation that basically happen in many, many sessions are not triggering you. Okay. That's something I'm also doing with my psychology and doctor colleagues, because in traditional training that doesn't happen, to go through these, sometimes difficult topics, and like a client blaming you or something happening, and all these things. It's difficult emotionally to deal with, and when you went through them and you dealt with them before, you're much better prepared when it actually happens.
But that's kind of a catch-22 though, right? Because I feel like what you're saying should be the standard. Like therapists, that should be like a standard of therapy, that you, specifically what you said, like if you're going to be a therapist, these are the things that you should clear, that you shouldn't have to deal with, that you should not be dealing with, or if you are, that you should clear, so that when a client comes to you, the quickest amount of the most optimal way to help them is already available. You being the best conduit to healing. But it's a catch-22 because most therapists wouldn't even. That's kind of the secret. That's kind of the dirty secret. Like it would take. It would take. It's kind of standard to say that it would take many years to clear a lot of things, or even just one big thing. Like from my perspective, I have personal issues with abandonment, and I spent maybe 7 years in therapy, and that was at the root of a lot of my issues, and a lot of my issues cleared up, but that one specifically didn't. And to be frank, I wouldn't even know how long. I couldn't tell you, like, if I would have just been 3 years and 2 months, it would have cleared. I have no idea. So it's just kind of crazy that that's a big issue.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm very sorry to hear that, what you just disclosed from you, and abandonment is very, very difficult topic, because it basically having attachments is having secure attachments is a core emotional need we have as children, and these have been frustrated, and basically feeling of abandonment forms. That's very, very, very tough, and that's why you should not do it perhaps alone, but with a therapist. And in traditional therapy, therapists have to complete a certain time to work as a therapist, hoping possibly that these problems surface and that they can deal with them. But they're here in the institute. They published it in the book Subcellular Psychobiology, Appendix 1, Identifying Stuck Beliefs in Therapists, and they're like, let me read something to you. It's too complicated. I'm afraid I will do it wrong and it will harm the client. I'm afraid I will draw a blank. I will misdiagnose and stuff like this. So these are all issues normal people have, and therapists are just normal people that have been specialized and learned in a certain way.
Right.
And then you have to work through them, and then it's the sessions run completely different.
That's incredible. That's great. And I think for me, that's the most interesting part of this. It's the idea that not only when you are dealing with some kind of emotional baggage, some very heavy pain, or some dysfunction stemming from an emotional issue that affects how you perceive the world, how you behave, then not only can you clear it and just not deal with that, but also the idea that it can completely reshape your perspective of the world and how you view things and how you view yourself. I think that's the other side of the coin that is really interesting and should have more attention. I don't think it has enough attention. I think most people, when they think about trauma, they think about, we've talked about this, very hard, heavy stuff, like very poignant stuff. And B, that that what you should do is you want to get rid of that feeling. You want to get rid of that. And to an extent, we know that, it affects how it shapes our world. And we want to go back to neutral. But I think also that we can become even better than we were before. There is this idea, like I know in somatic experiencing, I know that Adam Levine, Peter Levine, uh, talks about this, right? That he sees one of the many spiritual paths one can take is through meditation. Um, Something else I can't remember, but I remember very well him saying, and in trauma healing, the idea that trauma can actually be a gateway to these much better states of being, and not even just talking about peak states, but in general, just very normal day-to-day shifts in your personality or what you perceive as yourself, your identity, who you've always seen yourself as, how you relate to people. And to me, that's beautiful and that's incredible. And I think that's one of the most incredible things about being a human being and being alive, that you can not just kind of do these things consistently, but that there are, like meditation, or I like managerial things, so to speak, but you can do very hard things that ultimately will permanently shape you in a better way. And that's incredible. That's so cool.
Yes, and I like that very much that you said that, because that's the wish or the hope I have for my clients as well. They're not only dealing with their current problems, that might be difficult enough, but when they continue that path and when they continue using techniques and models and knowledge that we together worked on in therapy, that we discovered basically together in therapy, there's a good chance that that will help in the future as well. Okay, these so-called skills, or just what I just explained, the ABC schema. And now, if the listener just knows about the ABC schema, they might just think about it. Next time something happens, they just go: A, what's the situation? B, what's my judgment? And C, what's the consequence? Usually, you have A, the situation, and C, you have the consequence. And then you think, okay, what's my judgment? Why do I react this way? And then you are starting reflecting, and you can meditate on that, and you can do certain healing modalities on that, and then you shift your position. And usually, for the better. There are things, and that's the big warning, because we talked about the rebirthing things. There are certain situations around birth and so on, which I wouldn't do alone without an experienced therapist, because things can be difficult there. But if it's just like your partner or your boss or something like this, you don't need to go that deep always.
Got it. Well, would it be? This is a big question, but from talking from the perspective of trauma healing and the Peak States Institute, would the perspective be that most, if not all, of what we currently call mental illness is, for the most part, then trauma based to one extent or another?
Well, this question you can't answer wrong. To an extent, everything is trauma, but I wouldn't say that everything is trauma. We simply don't know. Okay, certain things, and I think we discussed that already. That for depression, we have at least identified 7 or 8 things that can lead up to symptoms which would be called depression, but that doesn't mean that it's conclusive. There might be more.
Okay.
So, and when somebody wants to do this technique and then wants to work on their depression with these techniques, we obviously go through them, and some of them we can help, and some of them we can't, and then basically need to find out why, and well, that's why we use that pay for results method, because if we can't help them, at least it's just a waste of time, from the client and from the therapist, but it's no money transaction there, and that's really important.
Okay.
We feel.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, since you are kind of in both worlds, um, there's this one thing that for me, because I studied psychology, and I only finished. I did a BA, so I have my bachelor's in psychology. So one thing that you get familiar with is a DSM-5, where I don't know if there's more a new one now, but the DSM basically. And it's filled with all these things that human beings can experience, um, that are very painful and very difficult. Um, some I know that the model we use right now is one that's more medical based, more on a diagnosis. Um, and I don't know if this makes sense, but when I think about these past years, I've been thinking about it more from a trauma perspective. Um, and one thing that comes up is like we have so many things that we classify as a mental illness or some form of dysfunction or a syndrome, whatever you may like to call it. But I wonder if applying these trauma ideas, it's possible to at any point in the future, like if you see it as a reality, like to classify why these things happen, like you guys are doing right now with the institute, right? Like we have depression or anorexia, and we could we could use these things to know why they're like why someone is feeling that way, as opposed to, oh, they just feel this way. Does that make sense? Because I feel like right now it just diagnoses it. There's not really a why attached to the DSM-5, or maybe I'm completely incorrect, but I feel like it's a diagnosis, but it's not like a guidebook to, okay, well, they're experiencing this. How could we move forward? What can we do about it now that we know what it is? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and I mean it's that's how medicine is. Medicine is a science, but it's based on empirical information. Mm-hmm. So medicine, you first observe, okay, and you see 10,000 people, and all have some sort of difficulties. It's common. All of them have the commonality that they can't function in normal society because they are too sad, or because they're too agitated, or because they're too saying stuff which don't make sense to other people, or whatever. So they have certain symptoms, and now from the observer, from the scientific observer, you need to somehow cluster them, because I need to talk to you or to other people about that patient, and I cannot always use like role play or something for that patient. It would be too time consuming. So I need to have a language to talk about it. And that might be DSM, or that might be the ICD-10, or any other classification describing what we see. And then obviously in medicine, there's also the search for why stuff happens. And then we find neurotransmitters, and then we do some imaging and so on. But this is still on a level where we're not 100% able to predict what happens. We can just have a hunch, a clue. But for example, when we talk about neurotransmitters, when they are too few or too little, the concentration is too small. Mm-hmm. Is that the cause, or is that just a symptom?
Right. And it seems like right now people think about it, for a couple of decades now, as like the A from A to C, and that what we've been talking about today.
Yeah.
The A as being the chemical imbalance, and because that is the conclusion that most or that is most mainstream right now, that A is the chemicals, then nobody else is looking further, right? And it seems like the A, it seems like at least now what we can go back to is at least a new A, which is trauma, right?
Exactly. Yes, and that's beautiful that you bring it up, because that's what I'm observing. That the chemical imbalance, and that's also coming more and more into study. That they say, well, there's stuff like also with antidepressants, that's sometimes not working, and placebo works as well. So what happens there? Okay. So is that the attention that person gets, that person was before lonely, or is that because that person didn't smoke that much anymore, or did eat differently, or ate, okay, because it had breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then before it didn't, so there was a chemical imbalance because of that? We don't know. There's so many factors. Mm-hmm. It can also be genetic, it can also be, and that's what medicine and research does. It tries to find the reason, tries to find models to predict certain things. And the Institute for the Study of Peak States has also found a model to be able to predict certain things. And that's what therapists from the Institute use. But it's, again, just a model.
Correct.
Perhaps it's the truth. Perhaps it's not. We don't know. But it works very good. Very well. So, so we use it.
I mean, yeah, that's a good point.
And with that model, basically, one can also explain why there's an imbalance in neurotransmitters. Okay, because trauma blocks certain metabolic pathways, and these metabolic pathways would be needed to create these neurotransmitters, for example.
The biggest difficulty then, it would seem, is being able to, in real time, see these changes, right? These epigenetic changes, these epigenetic kind of shifts when you heal something. Because that's where we are. I mean, I think the biggest book right now that kind of in a way says it, or at least lays the groundwork outside of, definitely outside of the Peak States Institute, is The Body Keeps the Score, right? I mean, that's the standard book in most trauma therapists in one way or another know about. And it kind of lays what you guys are saying, just in a more generalized perspective, that trauma is in the body. It's found in the body somehow. It's not in the mind. It's not that mental illness, and I really don't like calling it mental illness, if I'm being honest. I like calling it like a dysfunction or something like that, because I feel like there's so much stigma to it. And B, I don't know. I feel like dysfunction, it seems like it gives people more hope and more solutions. But that's just me. But yeah, I feel like The Body Keeps the Score does a really good job at kind of explaining that, right? That the reason we might think a certain way or perceive the world a certain way, it's not because of our mind per se. Again, that's not the A. Then the A is really our body. Like our physical body holds trauma, holds these emotional charges, and that becomes a translation in our minds, or it shifts in our neurochemicals. It does a lot of things, but again, then the A is the trauma. So I feel like The Body Keeps the Score does a really good job at kind of saying that too.
Yes and no, and I mean, obviously, when you have scars, body keeps the score. Okay, you know that something, at least the skin was broken, or something underneath was broken. Mm-hmm. Then there is something in medicine we call head zones. That, for example, means that something happens to your liver. You might not have pain where your liver is, but you might have it in your back. Okay, in a certain area in your back. Okay. And that's also known in medicine. And so from the Peak States perspective, in our model, we know and we work with bodily sensations, because we know that parts of the brain, or we believe, we don't know, sorry for that word, basically are mapped on the body. Right. And so since we are used to touch our body, it's easier to find these areas in the body mm-hmm. than to say, okay, now go to the left neuron in your brain and a little bit there, and that, I don't know, that's very difficult. Okay, right. So we work with the body, but from our model more as a point of that certain areas are projected onto the body, and so we work with that. But I don't know. So I don't know if it's really the body, if trauma is stored there. There are certain indications, yeah, and there's certain indication that it's just met, like these head zones we know in medicine. Um, as long as you get CPL with that technique,
That's
I'm
really
pretty
all that
happy with it.
matters.
Yes.
Got it. Got it. There's we've talked about a lot of these kind of issues that are important to the general public, in terms of like negative feelings, negative sensations. We also touched on something that's, while it is a negative sensation, um, maybe it's not as, um, you wouldn't call it maybe traumatic, because you just get nervous talking to your boss and you have these experiences around it, and most people wouldn't even classify it as something that's a big deal, even though it is. I mean, it affects how your life is, and again, it is a form of a trauma. But I feel like there are things that that are even more subtle. And what I mean by that is kind of like, dynamics, whether it's dynamics that you have with the world, or even something that's probably more understood by people, just family dynamics, right? Where families relate in many ways. They have many ways of bonding, they have many ways of communicating, they have many ways of making each other feel good, and sometimes making themselves feel bad. But I feel like, um, there I mean, a lot of people talk about how, um, they are the way they are because of their childhood traumas. And even ACE studies show that people that have a specific set of things before a certain age are more likely to develop, emotional issues, depression, anxiety, and other forms of just emotional issues. Um, is maybe I don't know if I can explain myself too well, but there are things that are even much more subtle, right? Like how people communicate with each other within a family system, or within relationships that you choose. And how do you? This is difficult to explain. How would you go about fixing a system like that, right? Where it's not necessarily that maybe, you know, mom or dad or uncle or whoever is abusive, but maybe there's something missing, or the communication isn't that great, or what else? What's something that's like big? Um, people that are like overly protective, or families that are overly protective, right? Like a mama's boy, or stuff like that. How how does these kinds of family dynamics, which are more understood under a psychoanalyst perspective, um, fit in with this trauma model, and what can be done about it? Does am I being clear? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think I understood something. I'm just writing down some notes so I can answer you. Okay.
Sure.
So I love that you said that certain things, when you experience them early on in childhood, makes it more likely for you to end up in a certain way, because it's not a cause and effect. Yeah, it's not necessarily this, and this is really, really important, because many people use that blame. Okay, because of my parents, and because of this, and because of that, I'm the victim, and they are to blame, and this is not entirely true. From my observation, yes, if you have psychiatric patients, most of them have had a difficult childhood. But you can't switch it around and say everybody who has a difficult childhood will up as a psychiatric patient, because there are mechanisms like the social environment. Simple things. Your parents, yeah, perhaps your grandparents. Your parents were difficult, and you have grandparents, or you had a great teacher, okay, and that great teacher compensated for many things that went wrong in your childhood, and therefore you didn't end up there. And especially from the peak states perspective, we know that the trauma didn't start after birth. It already started before. Okay, so it's basically not your parents' fault that stuff happened, but it's something that was already determined by your genetics or by your development in utero, that something similar will happen, and it just plays out. Okay, so I'm very happy that you said that. And regarding the family systems, let's take that ABC model again. Something happens. Somebody says, "Oh, you're late," okay, to a family reunion. Depending on my background, if for the last 12 months I have always been blamed of being late at work, though I wasn't, okay, I might be more sensitive to that comment, though that never happened to me. Okay, so depending on my background, depending on my judgment, depending on what I bring to the equation, to that sentence, to that blaming sentence, "You're late," I have a different reaction. That reaction that I have might be the A for the other person. Okay, so when I say, "I don't care," okay, that other person might react in a way saying, because the last past 12 months he has been always left alone and nobody cared about that, about him. So he comes to Christmas and then he says, "You're late," and then I say, "I don't care." And then this person gets activated because he feels like he's going to get abandoned or to get alone or something like this. And then this person might react in a way that he says, "How do you not care?" Okay, agitated. And now this "how do you not care" is again my new A, is my new situation. And if I react cool to it, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean that, and I didn't want to aggravate you," then perhaps this discussion is over, this conflict is over. But if I take this as an A and say, "How do you dare speak to me like this?" Yeah, because my background the last 12 months I have been bullied at work, then this again becomes the A for the other person, and then you have a perfect cycle. Okay, so even in cognitive behavioral therapy with the ABC model, you can model this system that happens there, and again, depending on how you judge the situation and depending on how well you are in balance, and that's what I call it. So you don't need to be trauma free. It's impossible. Okay, so there are so many things happened in your life, and they're going to happen. But if you're more or less in balance, you have more resilience to the situation, and you can react with more neutrality than when you're like completely stressed and when you're
right.
As the opposite. Okay, so working on yourself, doing meditation, doing trauma healing increases your resilience to certain situations, or resilience as other word as coolness, but not apathy, but it's just cool. Coolness. Okay, you're more relaxed in that situation, and then these communication cycles, these social interaction, might not necessarily engage into a whole big conflict.
Okay. Yeah. So absolutely. So that the A studies need to, and I think they are actually.
Are you still there?
Yeah, sorry, I was talking to myself. I didn't know I had you on mute. Yeah, so that, I mean, the real, and I actually just saw this. The other very, very, very important factor is that the A studies needs to include resiliency, right, into their model, so to speak, because resiliency then is a host of things. It's your environment, your people around you that are supportive, that could kind of fill in that hole, so to speak, of the things that maybe you didn't have. And also your kind of inner resiliency. You're talking about kind of like your genetic resiliency. Like, and this is something I know the peak Peak States Institute talks about a lot, which is the idea that some people are just born in healthier states. So you could say that, you know, it would take a lot more to get them to feel certain ways or even to trigger certain emotional dysfunctions or mental illness or anything else, right? Because they're in a much more resilient state. Um, so no, it makes a lot of
Yeah,
sense.
this,
Go ahead.
this is completely right. And for example, if you have experienced the state of inner peace, that is one part of a resilient state, because you're not triggered the whole day, like we had in the example before, when you go from trigger to trigger to trigger, and you're completely stressed out and drained. If you didn't have that, and it's the same 5 p.m. and something happens, you have more energy to deal with that. Okay, so that's completely true.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Which is really kind of crappy for the people that that don't know this, right? And I feel like that's a lot of people. I can speak on both sides because as I've mentioned to you before, this kind of all clicked for me when I first found out about the institute online, just trying to learn about trauma and trying to find therapists and stuff like that. That I see it both ways because my journey has been not one of just not feeling, dealing with little things and trying to heal them, like little things here and there that kind of pop up. One day it's something, one day it's something else. But the idea that before this, I've always felt like I was a very empathic person, a very heart centered person. But after I kind of went through this traumatic kind of, I don't know what to call it, just event that kind of awoke a lot of pain, I also felt like I lost a lot of that calm or that, I don't know, just not feeling like I was, like you're saying, some days just moving from one trauma to the next to things triggering me that I don't really know why they're triggering me or not making me feel just good. So my journey's been twofold, right? It's not just like, oh, I just don't want to feel this way anymore, but also like, I a big motivator is this understanding that, and I can see it around most days. You see it on, for me as somebody who's still, I'm still in my 20s, and I'm still in this, like heavily in this culture, like this internet culture. You go to Reddit, you go to Facebook, you go to etc., and you kind of see these kinds of behaviors play out on the internet, and people feel this way. I mean, people feel that they're, for the most part, just feeling pretty crappy all the time, and a lot of it's just jokes and memes. But as somebody who's been on both sides, you can see it. And before, it made no sense to me. Like, why do people, like, what is anxiety? Like, I didn't really understand that. So yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And this idea of resiliency, while it seems kind of unfair because you don't really get to choose, it makes sense that, you can kind of, again, build up to it. It seems like there's two ways to build up to it, right? You trauma heal so that there's less baggage so you don't feel as heavy, or you heal these earlier developmental events that can give you a lot more resiliency, like the inner peace state you're talking about, or like many of the other ones that the institute has, right? I think I've read like the underlying happiness, the walking in beauty, which is, it's like, I think the most wonderful one, and just a host of other ones, right?
Yes, right. I mean, these states are states the institute identified. Unluckily, there are not all the states. There are processes to reach them, and sometimes to reach them it's quite some work. There's a tendency to go to have a quick solution and just get a process and get it over with and then continue life. And yeah, for inner peace that would be nice, or for the silent mind, which would be also nice for many people to have it. It would change completely how we live. I think we covered that in one of the last episodes. But you still as long as we are not all in beauty way, you still need to do some trauma work, okay, to feel better and to take good decisions, basically. Yeah. Because if you take a decision based on trauma, it's most of the time regret it later. These are the typical decisions of, oh, how could I be? Oh my God, what did I do there? These are the decisions that are usually done from trauma, and so it's both. You can enjoy the processes to get to a nice state of consciousness, and you learn the tools to just simply feel better and feel CPL whenever. I remember for the last question when you talked about social interactions, I took some notes because I wanted to give some indicators. You asked me how to achieve that, not necessarily without trauma healing. And there are 3 things I would like to cover. First of all is blame. It's so easy to blame the parents for everything that went wrong. But is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think most of us, one way or another, do that. And it's hard because it's partly, I mean, I feel like part of it is trauma-based, but I feel like the other one is, well, a lot of things, but go ahead, continue. Sorry about that.
It's so easy to blame them. So they are the culprits and I'm the victim. And again, ABC, let's see why they behaved the way they behaved. Mm-hmm. And when you ask that question, most likely you will go into their footsteps, and then you can blame their parents. And they can blame their parents, and they can blame their parents. And that continues until Adam and Eve. And then we blame Adam and Eve for taking the apple.
Freaking Adam.
And did it help that we blamed them? Nope. Yeah. Nothing changed. So blame is just a coping mechanism to get out of that current miserable feeling. Okay? You feel miserable, and when you blame that onto somebody, that's the transference part, I feel so much better. But nothing changed. Okay? So if you want to change stuff, just take what you feel, just recognize what you feel, that you feel helpless, that you feel powerless, that you feel alone, whatever you feel, do the techniques, and then you change something, because then you feel better, and that will never come back, this dread feeling in that situation. Okay? There might be similar things, but this one that you healed, no, that won't come back.
Huh. But then what's left? I mean, what's left after you blame someone?
No, you don't need to blame. Yeah, blame is always an indication for trauma.
Right.
Easy. Okay, so blaming, if somebody blames somebody else, next time you see, oh, you're just using the coping strategy of blame, I don't listen to you, which will aggravate that person even more.
Right.
But perhaps well, you can be more empathic. You can say, okay, I understand, you're feeling horrible right now. Let's do something about it. That would be the nicer way. Okay, but blame doesn't help. The other thing is, if you want somebody to change, okay? I don't know, if your wife wants you to change to take out the trash every day, you simply don't get it. You don't want to do it, okay? Mm-hmm. But if she is basically saying, you have to change, or whatever happens, okay?
Yeah.
That's also an indication of trauma, okay? I mean, it would be nice if you help your wife take out the trash, but if she takes it that far that there are consequences, basically, that means that she has so much inner activation, that's trauma. You can simply heal it, and then you don't have that need somebody else to change.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it would be nice if we be more empathic to each other. That would be a good change for all.
Yeah. That's something that I've noticed in myself personally. We were talking about projection last week. Like I have this feeling where like I get really upset with myself that I spend so much time sometimes on social media apps, right? Like the internet they understand my inner algorithm, and I just can't like stop watching Instagram videos or TikTok videos sometimes. It's just they're too powerful. And I notice that after I do that, like I feel like I wasted a few hours of my day. I'll see my wife like on her phone, and I immediately and I used to do this. I don't do it anymore, but the feeling's still there. I see her and I'm just like, why are you on your phone so much? Like, why aren't you enjoying the day? And I'm obviously like just projecting my feelings and my insecurities or the way I feel about how I spent my day. Um, and I know it's like trauma related. I understand that it is based on a set of behaviors that I do based on procrastination or insecurities, etc. And then I kind of just I find myself I catch myself just enough now that I know that it's me. It's not her. She can do what she wants with her life. Um, but yeah,
Wow,
it's
I mean
crazy.
that is already wow. You're a great husband.
I try. I definitely try. Yeah, I definitely try. But it wasn't
So
easy. We had a lot of
that is
fights.
awesome.
We had a lot of fights about it. You know, like we have great communication, but we definitely had a lot of fights about it. And I mean I knew from the get go, but it's hard because ultimately again like you just don't want to feel like that. You don't want to have to rely on having these discussions every once in a while, or even just these triggers where you're just like, why am I so upset? Like it shouldn't be a big deal. So yeah, it's interesting. I find that
Now, now,
crazy.
now, let me use that ABC model again. So the first situation, you played lots of social media time on your phone, and one, I don't know, whatever, biological need, you get up and then you, oh my God, it's already 2 hours gone. And then you stop it, okay? And you basically are upset with yourself as a consequence. And the judgment is, I played too long,
Correct.
okay? So, and you just let it stand, okay? You don't work with it. You just let it stand and you let it be inside of you. And now with that attitude, basically, now the second situation, you see your wife using the phone for social media, and immediately, basically, the guilt of your first situation comes up because you didn't work with it, and then you say something to your wife. Why do you use your phone so often? And with her, that's like being judged or being whatever, however she feels, and then she reacts. Okay, now what you did, at least how I understand it, you changed your judgment. You said, okay, she can do whatever she wants with her life. So when you see her on the phone, you change your perspective from being, from feeling guilty about your behavior. You said she can do whatever you want with her, she can do whatever you want with her life, and so see your consequences. Okay, honey, should I get dinner? Whatever. Yeah. And so your C completely changed because you now, CBT wise, changed your B. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And it's great. I feel like that's a really good technique. It definitely takes a lot of practice. And to an extent, I think awareness and insight into these kind of human mechanisms is really powerful. It's like biofeedback, right? It's like this idea that if you understand how your system works, you can at least do something about it physically. But it's like biofeedback, but for a psychofeedback, and it is really helpful. But ultimately, what you want is to not. For me, my projection is not necessarily even about the internet. It's about little things about myself, like how I spend my days,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of
Very good,
things,
very
right?
good,
A lot of things.
very good.
Yeah.
Let,
So
let me just jump in there because I want to remember to draw a comparison to all the moms and dads that want her kids to be the greatest ballerina,
yeah,
best
next football
piano player,
player.
and so on. Okay, because they have that guilt inside of them, yeah, that they didn't achieve it, like you didn't achieve to stop social media. So the other person, yeah, that other person that you hold dear and that you love, needs to at least live up to your standards.
Right.
Isn't that fun?
Oh, it's a
Yeah.
blast. Yeah, and it's such a normal thing. It's such a normal thing in our lives. I mean, like these are things that we see. We even make jokes about them. They're in our TV shows. They're in our movies. They're in our. They're people we know. Um, so yeah, it's crazy and that's the difficulty because in a form this you wouldn't you call this trauma, like the mom who makes her kid become a child actor I'm not saying all child actors, but let's just say it for the sake of this, that some child actors, like the mom or the dad just makes them be this person, and ultimately like they become it, but maybe they never wanted to. Isn't this kind of just a trauma that got passed? Um,
Yeah, that's a transference basically, I think. And but for us, it's simply a guilt trauma you're trying to avoid. Yeah, you're trying to avoid feeling your guilt, and therefore you make somebody else change. And with your wife, making your wife change results hopefully in some counteraction, and it did, as you said, you had discussions, you had communication. And with a child, usually doesn't. So a child just does, obeys, okay, what it has to do. And so you have all these ballerinas and soccer players and piano players and whatever, because the child can't. They can't get that action against mom. Also, they don't love it. They still need the mom and the dad to love them, okay, because they're small, and so they will change their behavior. Okay?
Right.
But it would be nicer if the mom and the dad would look at that and say, oh, I feel so guilty that I didn't do it. Yeah. And then do the work. And then they say, okay, oh, my child can do whatever it loves to do, who he or she loves to do.
Right. Yeah.
And these children will end up being much happier when they're adults. So though parents think they're doing a good thing with providing all these clubs and whatnot, actually when they would work on their selves and what the child decide and just offer to the child, and then the child picks and just chooses their way, they will come around. They're very clever. But that's very, very...
It's very difficult.
Again, so we have... Yeah. So first of all, don't blame, because blame is just a coping, and don't make anybody change to your desire, because that's just your trauma. Okay? That's the second rule. And the third rule is you're responsible for your own emotions. And that's basically the underlying rule for everything, because you asked me how to diffuse social interactions. If everybody would live by these rules, social interactions much easier. Much, much easier. Okay? When I have a feeling, when you say something, okay, and I get a feeling, it's not your fault. I have to thank you that you made me aware of a trauma, and I just heal that trauma, and then we can continue the conversation, okay? And perhaps you are supportive, and you say, oh, Daniel, did I trigger trauma? I said, yeah, just let me do the thing, 5-10 minutes, and then we can continue the conversation. And then, wow, that would be utopia.
Yeah, absolutely.
Empathy, understanding emotions, being present for the other one, being empathic, that would be wow.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's kind of I feel like that's the kind of, maybe I'm wrong, but it could be a great gap, a big leap into this, taking away the stigma of just feeling how you feel, right? Like, because I feel like for the most part, I think it would be really cool. If it would be weird, but it would be great that when you're having interactions with people, you feel, I don't know, uncomfortable or whatever. Like you feel triggered, you feel aggressive, you feel defensive, you feel socially awkward, you feel embarrassed, and you could just be like, "I'll be right back," and then you come back in like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever. And you're like, okay, I'm good to go. I resolved this. I think it would also take away a lot of the stigma that we have around our emotions, the weakness, also the stigma around mental illness, which is crazy because we have we have a medical based model for mental illness. That's what we live with. That's what we live by. Yet we still have a stigma around it, which is weird because, a lot of times people compare mental illness to like diabetes, right? That's a big one. Like, oh, you just take medicine all your life, just like diabetes. But nobody's embarrassed about having diabetes. Like, there's not this big charge. And I think if at least, again, talking about biofeedback and talking about it as like psychofeedback, if just people in general understood trauma is something that happened to you, then a lot of this stigma would just go away just by sheer numbers, because we would understand that that's where it comes from. And I think that's still something that's like so weird for me that we have this stigma around mental illness. But anyway.
Yeah, and for me as well, it's very weird, but it's what is right now. And from my point of view, I explain that to me with helplessness. Okay, basically from what you heard from your neighbors, from your family, from other things that, oh, somebody had a depression and they will suffer for 10 years and they will never get out, or whatever the stories are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so because you are helpless, you better not talk about it. Though you don't know how many people you meet on the street and you meet at the grocery store or you meet somewhere at the dentist office or wherever who take drugs, medication.
Medication.
What's the English term for it? I'm sorry. No, that's the other ones. Well, anyway, like prescribed drugs for mental diseases, and prescription drugs. So many, okay, and they live a normal life.
Yeah.
And you don't know, okay? Just working in psychiatry, you will get, oh, okay, and then you just continue. Okay?
Yeah, that's true.
Because that's just how it is. And but if we would start from the start, when child is born, or even during pregnancy, if mom and dad wouldn't fight, if they would listen to classical music and they would be in a loving relationship, and mom would feel secure, and dad would feel secure, and there's communication in between these two, and that's how life starts, and that continues for at least for the first 8-9 years. That there's no argument in front of the kid, and that when there's an argument, again, these 3 rules: no blaming, no wanting to change somebody, and emotions are your responsibility. Okay, if that happens, that's a complete different set of a new generation we would raise.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
And actually, we're doing this. Okay, so when I talk to you and I have a biological urge, I would excuse myself and go.
Yeah.
Okay. And if I need to sneeze, I would go and grab a tissue and would sneeze and come back.
Yeah.
So we excuse ourselves out of these situations. And why shouldn't we do that when we feel, agitated?
Yeah.
And to just tell secret, I did that too. I sat in board meetings or in meeting rooms and at work, and I noticed stuff changing, and then I did the technique under the table. Nobody noticed. And then 5 minutes later, I was okay, good to go. And while somebody else was presenting or reporting or whatever, and then you resolved it. It's easy. Okay, you can do it this way, and then you basically avoid the conflict and you get along better, and yeah, there's not so much chance for failure there.
That's great. That's beautiful. My perspective is that I think that the reason why we still see it like that is that even though we see it as like a medical thing, I think it's more akin to like leprosy. I think people are afraid for 2 reasons, right? That it's almost like a virus, that if you're close enough to someone who's like feeling anxious or depressed, like they'll bog you down, or they'll bring you down, and like nobody wants a party pooper. That's kind of like the, and it's really a shitty way to think about it, but it is the truth. That's how people tend to think, and it's understandable. I mean, it is a heavy pressure when somebody's around you like that. And I think the other reason is because nobody likes to see themselves reflected negatively on, with someone they see. I think that's the reason we're afraid of people who are dealing with a form of psychosis, right? Like nobody likes to think that could happen to them. It's very, very tucked away in their mind. Nobody likes to think that, like they could be dealing with that stuff. Like that's something that could happen to them. And so like it's a very difficult thing to deal with on both sides. But I think the people who are more resilient, I think the people who are also more empathic because they've been through it, tend to be the people that are the most understanding. I don't think it's a coincidence.
No,
So
and actually, if you can see it in Hollywood, I don't know what was it? There was this series Supergirl, and the two main actors there, this guy and that Supergirl.
yeah,
I think one of them or two of them went through depression and later did this Instagram thing, mental awareness, something. So they went through it, and then they had the empathy, and then they worded or made it public and wanted to create awareness and wanted to create understanding.
yeah,
So that's exactly true. Yeah. And the interesting thing is, if you try to avoid something, like try to avoid being pulled down, try to avoid getting anxious, or even try to avoid psychosis, the likelihood for you to get it increases. Isn't that weird?
that is weird. How do you avoid it though? How would you be avoiding it?
Well, everybody, for example, for psychosis, everybody has certain things which are normal in every people, so that you think somebody called your name, or that you think about that number combination has a meaning. Okay, look at angel numbers, look them up in the internet. Angel numbers, big thing in the internet. I don't know if it's true or not, but there's trying to put meaning into things is one of the symptoms. And I'm not saying that everybody who does that has a psychosis. No. But it's just one of the symptoms. And if you feel a certain emotional arousal and you don't deal with it properly, it can accumulate. And perhaps we don't know, as we don't know the reason, cause of psychosis. But the observation is, the more you avoid things, the more likely you're getting to have problems with that. Okay, when you try to avoid, oh no, I'm not burned out. I can work another 10 hours today and tomorrow as well. No, I'm not burned out. I feel a little bit saggy and groggy and tired, but I'm not burned out. And next week as well, because that project has to be done. That is a good way heading towards burnout and depression. Okay, but if you say, okay, wow, last week 80 hours, this week as well, and next week, no. If you have some self-care and you say, no, that's not how I can do it, and you're not avoiding the situation and just trying to power through, but you say, okay, let's try. Okay, I understand the need for eight hours again. Try to change the perspective, but let's make it comfortable. Let's have somebody for stress relax, have a break, or take a walk around the lake, or something to change the situation. That is not avoiding, that's trying to cope or trying to deal, trying to manage with the situation, which has a much better outcome than just avoiding it or trying to look at the other way.
Okay. Well, that's.
You don't sound convinced, though.
No. I'm just thinking about it. I think you're absolutely right. I think you're right. I was thinking that's actually a really great, like, ending line, like, that's, don't avoid your feelings, because as you said earlier, you're in charge of your feelings. No one else is in charge of your feelings.
Yes.
So
yes. Let's use that as an ending line. That's awesome. Yes.
Yeah. Don't let them accumulate, and only you are in charge of your feelings. Yeah, I think that's great. I agree. I think that's a good way to end it. If for when people hear this, when we put it up and people stumble upon this, what do you recommend people do if anything that resonated with them sounds like something they want to work on? What can they do?
Contact us. Yeah, that's the most important thing. We can get into dialogue. Perhaps we can help. Perhaps we just can refer you to somebody who can help. And continue listening. There are more talks like this coming, and there are already 3 previous ones. So listen to them, and we'll meet.
Perfect. Well, I guess with that we can wrap it up. Daniel, as always, thank you for your insight. It's always great talking to you. Really love discussing this stuff, and like you said, I hope we can continue doing this, and that we just talk about this more and spread this information, and that people engage more, so that they can work on themselves and have, more fulfilling, happier, and less painful lives. So thank you for your time.
Celia, thank you. Yes, Celia, thank you for your time, and thank you for the awesome questions and keeping the dialogue flowing and happening. I enjoy it very much. Time just goes past very quickly, and see you next week. Thank you.
Sounds good. And likewise to you. Thank you, Daniel. Be safe.